Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. One of the great thinkers, one of the great arbiters, and if more folks in journalism approach it the way Myron Magnet does, he's a journalist with the City Journal, and he's just penned an absolutely incredible book. I say this only from the excerpting that my schedule has allowed me to read so far. But he's written a wonderful book called Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. Welcome. It's an honor to have Myron Magnet on the program with us. Myron, thank you for taking some time out with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to do it. I'm looking forward to it, Joe.
Most of our public leaders don't get a book like this until they've been buried under 6 feet of soft peat for a while. So I appreciate
hard Virginia clay.
Yeah. And so I appreciate you doing this, but how rare do you find? And some of the things you've written about Clarence Thomas's upbringing, I think you quote him saying, "I've lived all the goods and bads of the American experience," if I'm not paraphrasing badly there. But he's seen all the struggles of coming up through the South, where Jim Crow laws may have still been quietly whispered about in shadows, and the administrative state that was born out of quote unquote helping, and through that. Thank you for doing this. But how rare is an intellect like Clarence Thomas, and can we generate more of them, do you think?
Well, I think he's rare in the sort of consistency and comprehensiveness of his vision, but in a way he's a representative figure, I think, Joe, because I think that the bitterness of today's politics, in which Americans are divided into two camps that look at each other with bitterness and anger and in some cases real hatred, you can divide them into the Freedom Party, which believes that the government draws its authority from the Constitution of 1787 as improved by the Bill of Rights and perfected by the Reconstruction Amendments and the 19th Amendment giving women the vote. So there's that Constitution which guarantees liberty and expects self-reliance. And the other half of the population, the Fairness Party, let us say, believes in what Woodrow Wilson called the living Constitution, and believes that the Founding Fathers were these obsolete, antique figures, that the government they designed moves much too slow for modern conditions, and that instead of having a mechanical Newtonian constitution, we need a Darwinian one that keeps pace with the times. And so the Supreme Court should sit as a permanent constitutional convention, making up law as it goes along. And also, Wilson began the establishment, as you mentioned, of this gargantuan administrative state, a whole bunch of unelected bureaucrats who are supposedly highly trained, supposedly nonpartisan, supposedly with only the common weal on their mind. And what do? They make laws like a legislature, carry them out like an executive, and punish and adjudicate infractions of them like a judiciary. So as even Franklin Roosevelt saw and said, there's no warrant for this in the Constitution whatsoever, and there's no separation of powers to guarantee that government stays within its proper bounds. So I think that, to answer your question, Clarence Thomas, while unique in the focus, the sharp diamond focus of his jurisprudential vision, he really is one of the leaders of that party that I've called the Freedom Party, that don't you think that it really started coming into focus about a decade ago with the Tea Party?
I think you mentioned that in the book, and I was one of the leaders of the local Tea Party, founders of it, before anyone had heard of us. And I think what you found was a distinct feeling that nobody was listening, that government was just trundling about whether you liked it or not.
And something was wrong, you know, that we weren't, that we thought we were living under one kind of government, but it wasn't really so. But, 10 years ago, we couldn't quite figure out what was wrong. But Clarence Thomas had figured it out. And what I think that what, now looking back over what's almost 30 years of his career on the Supreme Court bench, if you were to kind of abstract what his theory is, you would say that the Constitution, with those perfecting amendments, even 232 years after the Constitutional Convention, drew up what remains the most modern, up-to-date, and even avant-garde conception of government that anybody has ever dreamed up. Because what did it do? You were talking a minute ago about Mr. Jefferson and his magnificent idea. Well, this framework of government that is the Constitution, after all, is meant to guarantee to every American citizen the right to forge his own happiness in his own way, in his family, in his local community, and not be ruled by somebody. And you really can't think of something that is more wonderful than that.
No, absolutely not.
Up to date.
We fancily, because Madison also, we count Madison as a local as well. Orange County is just the next county up. It's all part of the metropolitan area. So a couple of kids from Charlottesville is how I refer to them. But, Madison sort of is the guy who's like, great, you've written this amazing philosophy. Now I have to write a rule book to make it work. But I think they managed to in many ways. But you bring up in the book, and I don't know if this is your thought or something you picked up from Clarence Thomas, but a friend of mine once referred to our country as America Mark II, and that we were just coming up on our bicentennial or our centennial anniversary, because in those eras around Woodrow Wilson, many things were going on. The removal of the Senate from the state control, the capping of the size of the U.S. House of Representatives, many of the amendments, the administrative
the
income tax, the technocrat movement, all sort of created this secondary United States where the founding documents were artifacts, and that we were, and you said something brilliant in the book, that the Supreme Court was going to be a living, continuing constitutional convention where everything is up for grabs. And you see this with Obamacare and so many of these other things where even Republican Supreme Court justices are saying, well, I know this isn't technically constitutional, but I think everyone wants it, so let's rule that it's okay. And it's just amazing to me. But you really put it so beautifully in this book about this extra constitutional behavior since the last 100 years.
Well, and that was, the wonderful Constitution that Clarence Thomas values so highly really did get subverted. And what you're describing is the second stage of the Great Subversion, which Woodrow Wilson set in motion and the whole progressive movement.
Oh, okay.
And then Franklin Roosevelt supersized. And it's absolutely true that when you have the Supreme Court making up laws, that's not representative self-government anymore. And when you have experts making rules that are in effect laws and carrying them out, you do not have democratic self-government. Here's an example that was in the paper just, 2 weeks ago, wasn't it? So there was a rancher in Montana who was worried about forest fires this year particularly. And so he's got a little trickle running through his mountain acres, and he thinks, well, I'll dig a couple of ponds, so I'll have a reservoir in case fire breaks out. I can pump from these ponds. The EPA comes to him and says, just a minute. you have polluted the navigable waterways of the United States. This is in the mountains of Montana,
right?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
The nearest navigable waterway, even resembling, is more than 40 miles away. Right? You've polluted under our regulations. It's not a law; it's a regulation, and they end up. The end of the story is the guy gets fined $130,000 and sent to prison for 18 months. Now, that is tyranny. That's just plain tyranny. The federal government has no business telling a rancher in Montana whether he can dig a hole on his land or not, and they have no business with this kind of star chamber justice where somebody is prosecuted under a regulation that wasn't made by the people's elected representatives. So if you want to know, there's Woodrow Wilson saying, oh, man, we've got this super modern idea. We're going to have government by experts. Well,
and you make
super
the
modern
case.
means tyranny. And,
Right.
of course, as you know, Woodrow Wilson's model was a bunch of German philosophers whose ideal was Frederick the Great, the enlightened German despot who had this wonderful administrative state. But the trouble with enlightened despotism is the enlightenment always evaporates, leaving the despotism behind.
Exactly.
And I think that's where we've gotten to when you get examples like this EPA case in Montana. And then the third movement in this is, as you're saying, the Supreme Court, starting with the Warren Court in 1954, just going hog wild with making up laws out of whole cloth. So you even have, well, for example, you even have the Supreme Court legitimizing the overturning of basic guarantees of the Bill of Rights. So, campaign finance reform.
Right.
We all think that it's, or at least the mainstream media treats it like it's this holier-than-thou, pure, wonderful, cleanliness of government. But it's not. It's simply the muzzling of political speech.
Absolutely.
And Clarence Thomas is, just as he has written a whole stream of opinions against the administrative state and saying it has no foundation in our constitutional structure, so too, as he looks at campaign finance reform and all these restrictions on free speech, he's saying, wait, what do you think the First Amendment was for, if not for the protection of political speech?
Right.
And furthermore, to get back to your local boy, Mr. Madison, Mr. Madison, when he's writing Federalist 10, says, well, okay, we're going to have a democratic republic, but of course the danger with a democracy is that you can have the many ganging up on the few and producing the tyranny of the majority.
Yep.
And what would that tyranny look like, says Madison in Federalist 10? He says it would be the unpropertied many ganging up to take away the property of the rich few, whether by inflation or unfair taxation or confiscation or whatever you like. So by Madison's own showing, money should talk. Right? If property can't protect itself by numbers, at least it can protect itself by argument. And freedom and prosperity, that's your show.
Yep.
And at least corporations ought to be able to stand up and say, hey, we're providing employment. Right. We're creating wealth. Please stop beating up on us. At least listen to the case we're making about why we're doing good, not bad.
Well, I said to a progressive friend of mine, I said, you want the corporations to stop having a say in politics? And he said, yes, absolutely. I said, stop
right, and
taxing
only Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker will have a say.
Right. I said, then stop taxing them. He said, what do you mean stop? I said, well, isn't the country founded on taxation without representation? We fought back against that. You're going to tax a corporation, but not let them have a say in how their taxes are being collected or who's collecting them. That's amazing.
That is beautifully put. That is just beautifully, beautifully put.
Myron, we're running short on time, and I wanted to ask one point on this, and again, to push people to Barnes & Noble or should they go to City Journal? Where's the best place?
No, they should go to Amazon.
Amazon, order it there.
Yeah, and go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any bookstore, which you have many of in Charlottesville, although probably Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution is hidden behind the counter.
Well, but ask them for it. Although the young lady that runs our Barnes & Noble is a big fan, and so I'm sure she puts it back up where.
Well, that's where people should go to buy it then.
But I have to ask, is all of what you're writing about Clarence Thomas, as I read it, it starts to make more and more sense why it was blood sport to make sure that he didn't get onto the court in any way, shape, or form, by hook or by crook. The whole Anita Hill and all of that dog and pony show was really designed to keep somebody who was not just a rock-ribbed constitutionalist, but wrapped in the wrong kind of package, let's just put it that way.
And I'm sure you know the old saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Right.
Well, so the Brett Kavanaugh hearings kind of threw everything into sharp focus because they did everything by exactly the same playbook that they used in 1991 with Anita Hill. It was history repeating itself as farce. And so you knew, if you ever had any doubts about whether Anita Hill was telling the truth and whether there was anything in this case, once you saw the Democrats, and it was the same players, there was Dianne Feinstein, there was the Alliance for Justice or whatever it's called in Boston with Nan Aaron. I mean, the same cast of characters who were pulling this same stunt. And yes, it's because for 60-some years, the left has had its hand on this lever of incalculable power, and they didn't want to let go of it. But here's the last thought I would leave you with, and that's that if you look back over the history of the Supreme Court, as Clarence Thomas has done in the hundreds and hundreds of opinions he has written in almost 30 years now, you will see that when the Supreme Court twists the Constitution, it does not always twist it to the left. It also twists it to the right, and that's something we can talk about some other time. Mm-hmm. But everybody, left and right, ought to be an originalist, because what you want is a court that is there protecting that wonderful Constitution that is guaranteeing Mr. Jefferson's ideal of everybody being endowed with inalienable rights and created equal. And any messing around with that ends us up with tyranny of one kind or another.
Myron, it has been a joy having you on the program. I only wish I had more minutes in each hour. Maybe we can petition a government agency to make more minutes in an hour. But for everyone who looks upon me as a New Yorker and how I think with the Ted Cruz said he's just a New York conservative, and how conservative can they be? Here's another evidence. Exhibit A is Myron Magnet. Maybe
but I want to live in Charlottesville.
We would love to have you here. I could probably find you a job teaching in one of the private schools. I don't think they'll have you at UVA, but they would be honored to have you. Myron, again, thank you. It is Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. It's a great title because it makes somebody feel like it's one of the Harry Potter books, but
exactly.
Maybe somebody will buy it that's thinking of that and get into it and realize what it is. It's an amazing American story, and thank you for telling it, and thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Such a pleasure. Thank you, Joe.
And thank you all for listening, and for all of us who went through this week and commemorated the 75th anniversary of D-Day. I'll leave you with one quick thought I told my local audience on June 6th. Think of the Herculean task and the profound losses we suffered overthrowing nationalist socialism. While we teeter on the idea of fancifully imagining it, imagine how many died just in one morning in an effort to overthrow it. Until next week, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute, so long and thanks for all the fish.